All right, I hope everybody can see my screen. I should be sharing it, and I will look to see if anybody throws anything up in the chat window to say differently. But again, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're joining from. Appreciate you being here today. We're going to cover audit and accountability under the CMMC model today. As usual, we will kind of breeze through these slides. You know who I am by now. The agenda is the same as kind of every month how we're following, going through the same set of slides or types of slides. I've left the nomenclature and assumptions in there for each session in case this is your first time so that you can get up to speed with what we've been talking about. As well as I'm going to leave the important updates in there. I had considered possibly removing it so that you didn't have to see it each time. But again, you may not be here for a previous session. This might be useful for you. So today, when we're talking about audit and accountability, we have the same general resources as always, but we have a smaller number of additional specific family resources. So it's much easier if you're going to go out there and take a look at what they're asking for and what's expected of you. It makes your job a little bit easier. And we're only covering one family of practices, if you will. So it's a total of 9 different practices or controls, again, whatever you want to call it. I've listed them all out here, but before we get into each one of them, I think there's a piece that's worth discussing, which is how does this kind of overall process look like? What's expected of you if you're going through the audit, specifically for audit logs and audit logging? And what's the difference between audit logging if we're doing something for an investigation like a compromise or breach versus privilege access versus any other type? So one of the first things to do is to kind of get your mind around what is it that would be asked of you and what is it you're trying to accomplish. If you think about your current environment, and everybody's environment is obviously different, what specifically would you be auditing on? What devices do you have? What type of audit logs do they produce? Where would you send them? Is there a single central point to ingest them or collect them? Do you have tools that can process them and parse the data? Who would be looking at those tools and those logs? How are you actually making use of the audit logs to the extent that the auditor is expecting you to? How long are you storing them? You know, where do you store them? And do you have the ability to bring logs back from 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a week ago, whatever the case may be? And then what if you don't have the tools and you have to do all of this manually? And one of the things that you'll see is if you start to take that approach, it can either be a very simple, easy process, or it could be a very complex, difficult process. And what I tend to see over time is that most folks underestimate what's actually in scope and what they should be capturing logs for. So you might go and say, well, I'm capturing all my antivirus or anti-malware logs, and I'm also capturing all my Windows event logs. Great. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, of applications that we use that folks may have privilege access to that they could move laterally throughout our network if they were to compromise something. Are you capturing those logs? And then more specifically, let's say you're capturing network logs. Are you capturing them at the right level? Because most network appliances offer various logging levels. And the piece of information or pieces of information you might need in an investigation or at a particular logging level, but to cut down on the amount of traffic that's going across the network, you're logging at a lower level. So yes, you are achieving the goal of auditing and receiving logs, but then when you go to make use of them, will they be valuable? I think this is where it gets a lot more challenging. So as you're reading through what's on the screen and as we go, slide by slide, I wouldn't get hung up on the fact that you say, well, I do log events and I review them, so there I've checked the box. I think it's a much more in-depth, deep dive type question, and then having to almost play the role of auditor. So if you're sitting at work and you have someone that you can bounce ideas off of, and you say, okay, I'm going to, let's pretend that we're in an interview for an audit, you play the auditor, would they be able to come up with applications and questions and processes that you can't account for? This will probably help you in the process of prepping for the audit, but I tend to think that this is one of the more difficult ones to pass, if you will, and to get an auditor on board because so much can be in scope. And the more they learn of your environment and what you have in it, the more they're going to expect from you. Some of the other ones, like, security awareness training that we covered, that's pretty cut and dry. You're doing it or you're not. You're recording it and keeping a ledger, or you're not. So keep that in mind as we go through. If questions come up, as always, throw them in the Q&A, and I will make sure that I address them before the session ends. And for today's session, I wanted to stick with kind of questions for the most part to ask of you, so that you get you thinking when you go back and you're thinking about this later. Because again, one of the things that you're going to want to do is determine, can you even do this on your own? Is a tool a better route? And in most cases, the tool is the better route. And then even once you have the tool, are you staffed and knowledgeable, both from a skill set and a resource perspective, to do something with those logs to the point that you would pass? So for this first control, creating and retaining system audit logs and records to the extent needed to enable monitoring, analysis, investigation, and reporting of unlawful or unauthorized system activity. And notice that it says to the extent needed. It's not prescriptive enough to say, do you have Windows logs? Do you have endpoint logs? It's saying the extent needed. Typically, we're going to consider using log ingestion as a task for a SIM tool, System Information and Event Management. In Ntiva's case, we call it IDR because it's performing both intrusion detection and functioning as a SIM. But at the end of the day, the concept is the same. You're going to identify all the different types of logs and all the different devices that you might have, physical or virtual, and you want to point them to one single ingestion point, which is the SIM. The SIM is going to parse and make use of that data. And then ideally, you're going to have depending on the size of your organization, one or more analysts who are going to be able to take that data and turn it into something relevant with alerts, dashboarding, triggering, et cetera. But questions that you need to be asking yourself are things like, how do you capture the logs and parse them correctly? A lot of devices, it's simple enough to go in there and say, point my logs to this IP address and this port number. Others don't have anything natively built in. Some you can install an agent on where the agent already takes care of forwarding of logs. Others you can't because it's a package that came from a vendor. So there's a lot of architectural details and planning that usually has to go into how am I going to get all the logs? And then, as I already said, kind of as a preface, how do you determine what are the correct logs and what the correct logging levels are? One of the more difficult things is when you start talking about applications, especially custom applications. What are all the different types of logs the application has the ability to produce? Where do those logs natively get stored? Do you want to capture them and forward them on? And in some tools, for example, you have to point the tool itself or the agent to a specific directory and say, look here for this log. If you don't, you can install the agent and you'll think that, okay, I'm logging and the device is logging, but nothing's being sent off to the SIM. And then you've got to decide things like how long do you want to leave logs in different storage temperatures. We usually use terms like hot, warm, and cold, but from a storage perspective, there are different costs involved in each of these solutions, as well as how long you retain things. So if, in most cases, let's say that you're going to have at least 30 days, maybe up to 90 days of hot storage. You may go up to a year in warm storage, and then you may archive, let's say, for 5 years in cold storage. Well, if you need to do an investigation tomorrow, you have to respond to some request. Obviously, you can't do it as quickly in cold as you can hot. The benefit and offset to that is you're not paying as much to store it. So you have to look at your type of data, the work, the industry that you're in, and look at the types of events you get and what are the most frequent type of searches. If you rarely ever search outside of 90 days, then maybe putting everything in hot up to 90 days is great, and then it immediately goes to cold storage. You get that immediate need based on your usual behavior, and then you get the cost savings of the cold. But again, this is a decision each organization has to make. Number 2 here, ensuring that individual system users can be uniquely traced. This is a little bit more difficult. Most of the logs will show things like someone logged in to VPN at this time, someone disconnected from VPN at that time. You might be able to combine a VPN log with a Windows host log, and you can say, well, I saw the individual log in at 8, and I saw them, log into their workstation at 7:45, which is how they got on it to create the VPN connection. what did they do from that point on? They may have logged off at 4, so I can validate they were on the network. Were they working? What were they doing? What were they touching? Again, it's all being logged somewhere. The question now becomes, are you capturing those logs, or are they just being generated and then lost on the end device? Are you capturing host logs, network logs, user logs? Again, there are specific applications that can help with this that you can buy that will make use of that data, but someone has to identify this. What about, are you capturing logs needed to follow users? It's kind of like, I said, think of a camera throughout an airport or city. If you've ever watched any type of investigative journalist type show, they will show someone walking through a city, driving through a city, whatever. And over the course of time, they're able to track their movements through different cameras that are positioned throughout the city. I would look at your network in the same way. If you don't have enough cameras and you don't have the cameras in the right spots, you're going to have gaps. And then when you do have a compromise, the first thing you're going to ask is, how did this happen? How do you know they didn't do something else in my environment? How do you know they're really gone? And if the answer is, well, I can see the front door and I can see the back door and I can't see anything in between, what do you do? And one of the common problems is that when folks set this type of solution up, they think that it's set up accurately to begin with. They don't know or test it until an actual compromise occurs. When it does occur and they find out, well, I wasn't capturing the right logs and the right logging levels, there's no way to go back and say, well, retroactively, give me what I needed for the past 30 days. You can fix it moving forward, but that doesn't help you in the middle of your crisis. And being on the MSP side, I can tell you I've had quite a few of those where, as a client, you guys experience something, you're looking for help and you're looking for answers, and I'm not able to support because you don't have X, Y, and Z. It's a terrible thing that we have to say, but it's reality in many cases. And you also want to look at things like privilege identity management tools, or PIM tools. They can be expensive. There's quite a few of them out there, some better than others, but they can track things like actually recording video every time someone logs into the host. They can record all the keystrokes. You can see what they did, whether a change was made intentionally or unintentionally, malicious or non-maliciously. Ties in very well to your change management processes, because you can see, for the changes that were made, was there an approved change record? But again, these are extra things that you can add on. They have a lot of other functionality you can bypass, you can prevent them from bypassing your tool and going directly to a host or using a local account. You can funnel everybody through one of these, like we basically call them bastion hosts. And when you funnel people in through it, you can see who has access. You can identify what they have access to. You can even identify what they see on the network. So you can get to the point where an individual may see 5 servers, even though there's 100, but that's all they have access to. So that's the only thing they can see. So quite a few options out there, again, for you, but the bigger concept here is, how are you tracing these individuals? Review and update logged events. What are you capturing and reviewing? How frequently are the logs reviewed? How are you documenting the processes you follow? Where's the evidence? This is probably the most important slide, even though it's the shortest and looks like the simplest. But you have to determine all this in advance. You have to capture it. You have to document what your processes are so you can show the auditor. And then the auditor is going to look to see that you're actually following your own documented processes. So where's that evidence? I assure you that in the audit, this is not the time to try to figure that out. So any testing, any type of reviews you can do in advance, the better. Alert in the event of an audit logging process failure. This is a great one that most people overlook. I set my device up to send the logs, but if something happens and it stops sending logs, do you even notice? One of the ways that we've solved this in the past, for example, was to create on a dashboard that if I had 5 firewalls, I wanted to see the total amount of traffic per day that the firewall is producing, and it was in a bar chart. You're obviously going to have some fluctuations day to day, but let's say that 10% is your acceptable threshold. If all of a sudden you saw a 40% drop in logs for the day, you don't even need to be alerted in any other fashion. You know that the device is down, or it's, maybe it's operating, but it's not sending you the logs. You can go look at it. So you've got to figure out that type of scenario. And will you be putting this into a dashboard because you have a person that's monitoring it live? Or does that need to then trigger an alert, trigger a ticket, et cetera? Who responds to it? How are all these actions captured in writing? How do you pass this off from one group to the next if it spans different shifts? Who do you report findings to? Who has access to logs? These are all organizational processes that, regardless of the solution, you still have to define these and document them. And once again, the most important part, the auditor is going to want to see that you actually followed it. So if you did show that logs weren't being captured at some point and you were alerted on it, what were the steps after that? And probably most important, what are you doing to try to prevent it from happening again? Correlating the audit record review, analysis, and reporting for investigations. Obviously, this one's extremely important because if we're going to be dealing with law enforcement, you're going to be dealing with terminating an employee, you're going to need all the evidence that you can obtain. So do you have the qualified personnel who are available to review and analyze this behavior? Do you even know what unusual activity looks like on your network? It may sound like a silly question, but that actually has to be defined. In a global environment, different countries, different regions, different cultures, they work differently. They may work at different time zones. Their behavior for them may be normal, but abnormal to you. And if you work in multiple environments, you'd have to know what usual and unusual looks like for each of those environments and then build out your solution accordingly. So, once you do that, what is your reporting process? And specifically, if we're talking about law enforcement investigations, do you have any type of federal, state, local, or contractual reporting obligations? If you're working with the federal government in healthcare, military, defense, et cetera, you likely will have something in your contract that states who you have to report to. And it could be a combination of the state, some state entity, as well as some federal government entity. And there'll be different timelines of what you report, how you fill out the reports. Do they have their own templates? How quickly do you have to respond to them? All of this needs to be known in advance and make sure that your processes can support both the contractual obligations as well as what the tool and the solution is actually providing. And then probably most important here when we talk about unauthorized or suspicious or unusual activity is really how are you tracking the indicators of compromise against a bona fide attack? There's a lot of behaviors that in and of themselves do not scream breach or attack or insider threat, but the combination of those things might. So again, this goes back to the logging and tracing levels. If you're capturing a portion of logs, you may not be seeing all of the indicators of compromise that would normally alert you or trigger something to you. So seeing one or two things happen, you might say this is okay. Had you had the data to see 10 different things happening at once, you would say this is statistically unlikely, and there's probably something else going on that you need to investigate. Provide the audit record reduction and report generation to support on-demand analysis and reporting. These are great questions here. What reporting is available to you? Each product out of the box has some canned solution, but will that canned solution meet your needs, or do you need to customize? Do you need to send it to another application that maybe you can customize a little more? Are the reports in the process in line with a compliance certification you're required to adhere to? So obviously, if you're on this webinar, many of you are going down the path of CMMC. You may be doing audit log collection and reporting and reviews, but will it meet the certification requirement versus just industry best practice? What are you doing with the data presented in the reports? If you're holding after action meetings or anything like an after action meeting and you're identifying failures and you're recording, hey, this is what we should do, how many times do you actually implement them versus just recording it? And then you find yourself 3, 6, 12 months later going through a very similar incident, holding another after action meeting, and your recommendation in that meeting was the same as the one previously. That doesn't show maturity from a certification perspective. So if you're going to go work on, say, an ISO certification, because CMMC is checking the boxes for ISO, and they say, show me how you've matured from last year, and you show them the evidence that you're doing these things, but you haven't implemented any of the fixes, it will be difficult to describe your maturity. Not to say that you won't still pass, because you may still have a well-documented and a good security program, but it's that maturity and that improvement in maturity. So you may not go from level 3 to 4 to 5, or et cetera. And providing system capability that compares and synchronizes internal clocks. This one's one I think that's often overlooked, and I'm glad they put this in here because a lot of folks will use various different network time synchronization protocols. It could be allowing Windows to do it itself. You might have your own NTP server. You might point things out to servers on the internet. But the point is, imagine if you're trying to capture logs from 100 different devices and all these different users, and the timestamps aren't synchronized. It would be very difficult to figure out who did what in what order if the times are off. Now, in a lot of cases, it's not a big issue because you might be talking about a second or less or a couple seconds. And clearly the individual is not able to move around and do things in under a second. So if it's off by a little bit, that's okay. But ideally, we want everything to synchronize. It has a lot of effect on operations outside of security. So it's good to do it for everything outside of security, and then offer that kind of integrity and accuracy that you would be looking for in an investigation. And you will have to figure out, do you need to buy specific hardware to complete this task? What does your organization look like? What are the types of devices? Where are they? It may not make sense. You may not even have a place to put the hardware. But again, these are all things that you just have to think of that I think natively don't come up in our first thoughts when we say, I need to be doing auditing. Another overlooked one is, how do you protect the audit information and the audit logs and the tools that are used from unauthorized access? We talk a lot in smaller organizations of wearing multiple hats, having collateral duties, but this is one of those areas where separation of duties and least privilege really come into play. You don't want the individuals who audit the environment also doing the work. It's very easy for someone who does the work or doesn't do the work as a result of a role that they have, going in there and potentially modifying the tools or the logs to cover their tracks so that you don't see the fact they haven't done something. A good example of that might be your vulnerability remediation program. You wouldn't want the same folks that do the scanning to then also do the patching and remediation. Because if they get busy, something happens and they don't want to look bad, what's to stop them from modifying the results? How do you make sure admins can't erase logs? I think when we ask questions like this, we tend to think that it's malicious and, well, my people wouldn't do that. What if it's an accident? I mean, hitting the delete button is not that difficult, and it does happen. And then you're relying on backups and restorations. How do you ensure safe, secure transmission? What if these logs are coming from lots of different sources inside and outside of your environment? They need to traverse the internet. How are you getting them safely and securely to the tools themselves? So all questions that you need to be asking. And again, these are all ones that get asked after you've designed the majority of the solution. It may even be after you've deployed it, with the exception of the secure transmission piece. So these are things that you may not think about day one, but you should at some point. And then lastly, the limiting management of audit log functionality to a subset of privileged users. How do you limit the access to the files themselves from a permissions perspective? How do you make sure no one with access modifies the logs? And then how do you audit user access over time? The third one is probably the most difficult because it's the most time consuming. The others, you set, everything that we've talked about, you set this stuff up in your environment, and then as long as it stays up and running, it's almost like set it and forget it and walk away. It's doing its thing. But the last one is not. And a good example of this would be, you have an application in your environment. You say that user logs are audited, let's say once a month, to make sure that anyone who's joined or left the organization has been added or removed. They have the right privileges based on their role in the organization. But as you start adding up these different applications, you might be getting multiple audit log reviews each week. That becomes very time consuming. And what happens if there's 400 users on an audit log review and you've got to go to 10 different departments and say, please confirm this? It creates a ton of overhead that most organizations aren't capable of managing. And what happens is you start sending out all of these reports, or your security team does. No one reviews them. And when an auditor comes in, you can say, I have a process, but it will cease to exist or fail when they say, then what did you do with the data? So everything will look great right up until that, what did you do with the data piece? So again, very important. Again, it could be very complex. It could be very simple. and the biggest thing to remember here is it's probably defined by the scope of your audit. So the more you can do to reduce the scope, the easier the job is. And that's it. So coming in just a couple minutes before the bottom of the hour. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them here. I will hang out for the next minute or two and see if any questions come up. But if there aren't any, I want to again thank you for joining, and hope to see you again next month.